Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to be doing a part two here, deep dive into the Applying to College forum online in Reddit. And we're going to be looking at some various questions from students and parents and going through these, hopefully, to shed some light on some different parts of the admissions process that will be helpful to all of you as well. Okay, so we have 5 questions to go through. Let's kick things off with number 1. So the first question here, the title is, does NHS, National Honor Society, actually matter? So the question is, I feel like so many people list NHS on their apps that it doesn't look prestigious to colleges anymore. Even so, would it hurt my chances if I don't take advantage of the opportunity to join NHS? This person is correct in terms of NHS not being a differentiator for top and highly selective colleges. It is simply too common, and too easy to get into, and many high schools just have removed their student bodies from contention for this accolade. So it is not something that's going to help to differentiate your candidacy. We've probably mentioned this before on other episodes. Many of you are likely aware. It is just simply there are too many students who qualify for it, and it's just not impressive and differentiating enough. Now, that being said, obviously, if your school does award it, we have had students who've won it, and then they are also sort of, there's sort of the activity of NHS, and then there's the accolade of NHS. And so they were, the president of the chapter, and they organized certain activities. And so if the activity component of it, the student, has spearheaded some important initiative that's relevant to their hook, well, that sort of serves just like any other activity, right? That's fair game for potentially differentiating the student. And you would look at that in the same way you would look at any other extracurricular, which is it relevant to the student's hook? What sort of is the depth? How unique are the contributions, or how unique is the theme? If it's just sort of a service activity and it just has some generic service themes, then it's going to, again, just sort of take the form of many other generic service activities. But if there is something interesting the student's doing in terms of NHS as an extracurricular and an activity, then that may actually help to potentially boost their candidacy a little bit. But in terms of NHS and the membership as an accolade or as an award, to go in the honor section, that is not actually going to differentiate you. Now, that being said, if you basically have no other awards whatsoever or very few, this is always the big contextual nuance when you're talking about including something in your application. It depends a lot on the student and how many other awards or activities or other aspects that would be impressive, right? So when you have limited space and you can only put 5, everything sort of just depends on what the student actually has, right? If the student has 5 major awards, then 100% the answer is going to be no. If the student, has basically 0, you generally don't want to leave the honors and awards section. You don't want to leave it blank usually. So it may go in there. You just have to understand that's not really doing too much. Second question here. So the title is Dual Enrollment and Upward Trends in GPA. So everyone loves this topic about upward trends in GPA. So the question is, I just had an honest question. That's great that it's an honest question. We want it to be a dishonest question on how admissions officers, specifically at these top schools, view dual enrollment and upward trends in a student's GPA. I have 24 dual enrollment credits, 6 at my local high school and 18 at my local community college. I also have 3 honors and 1 AP. My ninth grade year was very poor, and I believe I had a 3.05 unweighted GPA. By the end of my junior year, cumulative unweighted GPA was 3.83. My entire senior year is dual enrolled at a local community college, and my first semester grades were 3 A's and a B. I'm curious to know if this is will regarded, so the English is a little bit messed up here, to high school admissions officers, because my unweighted GPA is still held down by my freshman year and is only a 3.39. Thank you. Okay, so everyone sort of knows our take. B's are not good. A 3.39 GPA. I'm assuming the scale's at a 4 here in freshman year. Also, not good. The students obviously fighting a major uphill battle and, very likely to be far less competitive for top selective colleges. In terms of the question on how admissions officers view dual enrollment courses, they are generally considered relatively on par with other college level courses. That being said, you do have to use some common sense. If you have a pre-calc class that's dual enrollment at a community college, that's obviously not going to be better or more impressive than AP Calculus BC, for example. And that's just basically the same as with AP classes. All APs are not created equal, and so all dual enrollment classes are not created equal. AP Environmental Science is not as impressive as AP Physics C, and so there are just different levels of APs in terms of, perceived and actual rigor. So you just have to understand that in terms of dual enrollment classes as well. But generally speaking, dual enrollment are relatively unequal footing with other college level classes. Then in terms of the GPA on the upward trend, so the student was a 3.39 in freshman year. They're up to a 3.83 in junior year. This is something that does happen to many students. It's probably not going to be as low, particularly students targeting high selected colleges, a 3.39 in freshman year. That's really, really low. I think a lot of students and parents, and again, it's of course going to be, a lot of the people who have this issue and are going to sort of want somebody to reassure them and console them and sort of, they sort of raise their hand at the admissions officer, in a lot of cases just sort of, sells them a bill of goods and sort of says, oh, we, do a holistic review and we look at the upward trajectory of the grades. I think a lot of people just fundamentally don't understand what's going on. So if the question is, if the student had a 3.39 in freshman year and they kept their GPA relatively stable, or let's say they only got it up to a 3.6 by junior year, is this better having a 3.8 and having a bigger ascension and the GPA going up over time? Is that better compared to the version of the student that simply their GPA basically stayed flatlined at a low level or just didn't improve as much? Of course, right? The answer is obviously yes, right? You would prefer that your grades are on an upward trajectory, right? This is very commonsensical, right? If they started lower. But that's not what is actually going on. That's not how admissions actually works, right? And a lot of people, I think, have this mindset of sort of this is like school, right? And you're sort of being compared, against a rubric or something, right? But that's not how it actually works. You're being compared against other students. And so this basically is more or less a percentile curve, right? The admissions is driven by supply and demand. So the question isn't, will admissions officers like an applicant more if their grades, started lower and have gone up over time? Of course, right? There's an obvious answer to that. The question is, do they have enough students who don't even never even had that issue in the first place, right? Because they just started out of the gates, right? They started off, they started with a great head start and they never had any Bs, right? And they were just straight A students all throughout high school. The question is, are there enough of those students that I don't even need to entertain students who had lower grades, right? And the answer to that question is often yes, right? There are so many students who never had this issue at all that even if it looks good or it looks better, or even if there's some justifiable excuse as to why the student's grades are lower, it's just choosing between two candidates for a job, right? And so candidate A has something that's suboptimal about their application, but they have a very good excuse. Candidate B doesn't need an excuse because there is nothing suboptimal about their application, right? Which one would you pick? Probably would just pick the person where they don't even need an excuse because there's nothing wrong in the first place, right? And so again, a lot of people they think about this in the wrong way. If you're thinking about it from just essentially a supply and demand perspective, if there are enough students where this is not an issue at all in their candidacy, you have to understand, even if you do have an excuse, even if you have an upward trajectory, you just potentially are susceptible to losing to those other students who don't even have that issue at all in their candidacy, and so don't need any type of an excuse or their grades going up. Now, of course, that being said, there's different degrees here. If you had 189 and it was in ninth grade, right? There's different degrees here, right? Versus you had the 89 or the 88 in, first marking period senior year, and the college requires those grades, right? And so, what's the relevance of the class? There's just a whole bunch of nuances, obviously, right? But the unequivocal goal is that everybody, of course, should, if you, again, want to be giving yourself the greatest probability of success in terms of applying to highly selective colleges, you don't want to put yourself in a position where you need to make excuses or you're giving the admissions officer something and it requires justification, right? Oh, my freshman year was like this, but look at that, but look at this, but look at that, but and how you actually phrase that, whether you put it in your essays, your additional information section, your counselor talking about it, the logistics also become fairly complex in terms of how it gets adequately and best addressed, so it doesn't look like it's an excuse. And so you just don't really want to put yourself in that position. So the optimal approach is always going to be maximally being prepared for each academic year and being ready to hit the ground running. It is just the case that many students, when they understand the very dire consequences to getting lower grades and how threatening that can be to their goals, if those goals are important to them, and when they put in all the effort and the preparation and they're worried about getting their grades and they do the summer prep, they do the tutoring, they get the syllabus, they do the preemptive whatever it is, you usually don't see these problems nearly as much, right? The same students who's maximally aware of this being an issue, maximally prepared, all of a sudden it's not an issue anymore. It's usually mostly an issue because a lot of people are just lackadaisical, they're complacent, they don't have the urgency, and a lot of people have sold them on this narrative of, "Oh, if you get some lower grades, you could bring it up because admissions officers." It doesn't make any difference, right? What admissions officers, whether they like that, they don't the end of the day, are there enough candidates that they can take who don't have this issue at all in the first place? And the answer to that question is usually going to be yes. Now, there is some threshold, right, where if you are too far below the line, you're just automatically basically rejected, and there's just nothing you can do to bring it up. Again, if it's a B plus, an 88 in ninth grade, you have to understand there's going to be a ton of students who don't have that B plus in ninth grade that you're competing against. And so you're going to have to really massively make it up with the rest of your candidacy, right? And so again, there's different threshold effects here, but you don't want to put yourself in that type of position if you can avoid it. And a lot of people have this sort of wishful thinking where, again, they want to be consoled or to be reassured that everything's going to be okay, but it just is not the reality of the situation when there are so many students who just don't even have this issue in the first place. Okay, next question. So the title here is Class Rank Diminishing Returns. So the question is, at what class rank is it not worth it to push higher? Currently, 7 out of 301 students, so they're number 7 out of 301 students in their high school graduating class, with the highest SAT score by 80 points. Is it worth it to focus more on extracurriculars rather than attempt to push higher, top 3 in the class, for example? Okay, so I really love this question. This may be the best question out of any of the questions we've gone through here in the Applying to College thread in Reddit. So, this is something that is very important for a whole bunch of different aspects of students' candidacies. And it just basically comes down to identifying what, basically what's enough in terms of your candidacy. Now, as I mentioned in earlier episodes, in the 5 rules of the lead admissions game, Part of the problem is you don't necessarily know what enough is, right? Because this is a game that is non-iterative, the admissions game. You don't get a grade like you do in school, you get a decision, right? And once that decision is rendered, the game is over and you don't get to replay the game again, right? So, and we do not 100% know, nobody knows, even the admissions officers themselves, they don't even know how many applicants there are going to be, and they don't know what, the exact credentials of those applicants are going to be. And so it is a game that is characterized by a very high degree of uncertainty, right? And so, there is a very strong argument to be made, and the argument that I've made, which is you generally need to be in a mindset of doing the most for your candidacy because you don't actually know what the final score is that's going to be required, right? You don't see how many points you have, so to speak. You don't see how many points other candidates have. You don't know what the cutoff is actually going to be, right? And so, by that logic, you don't 100% know. That is the best general default mindset, right? Is that everything matters, everything contributes more points to your candidacy, and that is generally a default mindset that most people should be in. You don't know what the ultimate point total is that's going to be required for you to go to the college that you want to go to. And so you have to be in a constant state of getting more points and constantly optimizing all the various aspects of your candidacy, right? To give yourself to run up the point total as high as possible and hope that it's enough at the end of the game, right? Because you will have no other chance. You will have no other do overs. That being said, we do have, if you have expertise and experience with this process and you've seen what students get in to certain colleges, and you see what students don't get into certain colleges, you do have approximations of what enough is, right? And so, of course, you can start to approximate things and you can start to estimate sort of where there are diminishing returns. Diminishing returns, though, is not the same thing as no returns, right? And so, diminishing returns, I've mentioned this analogy before on the podcast. If you're an Olympic level track athlete, you have extremely diminishing returns in terms of further shaving off, any more time from your races, right? If you're a 100-meter sprinter, shaving off 1/10 of a second may be extremely difficult, and you may spend 4 years trying to take off 1/10 of a second. But in terms of a winner-take-all game, more or less, right, what's the difference between a gold medalist, and somebody who doesn't medal or second place? The difference is basically everything, right? And that's how admissions works as well. It is a binary outcome, right? And so, even if the process of accumulating the points, so to speak, in your candidacy or shaving off the time in the process, even if it becomes quite inefficient, meaning it requires a lot of effort and a lot of energy, it could be that that massive amount of energy for that small increment of improvement just pushes you over the thresholds again, where basically that just changes the binary, outcome from getting into the college or not getting into the college, right? And so this is basically something that a lot of people just don't sort of quite understand. You might not need someone to make your candidacy twice as good. You might only need someone to make your candidacy 1.1x as good. But the difference between 1.1x and 1x may be the difference between you getting in or not getting in, which basically means is the difference, it's everything. That is the general mindset that most people should be in, is that we don't 100% know what the overall point total is that's going to be required. And so you just need to understand that is just the characteristic of this type of game. It has a lot of uncertainty. Diminishing returns, as I said, are not the same thing as no returns, right? And so you have to understand that as well. And it doesn't really necessarily matter that the returns are diminishing. Basically, as you get better in any field, the returns become diminishing, right? So how easy is it for a 14-year-old sprinter to take off 1/10 of the second, in terms of their sprint versus how hard is it for an Olympian who maybe again spends 4 years trying to take off 1/10 of a second. Diminishing returns, it doesn't mean no returns. You have to understand that as well. Now, in terms of answering this question, it's great that the student is thinking about this. That's the first thing. A lot of what I say on the podcast is just so people are aware and have the frameworks, or they're aware that something may be an issue in their candidacy. It doesn't mean that I'm issuing a final verdict or I'm saying definitely do this or definitely do that, right? Again, it just depends on a lot of the context and, the different factors in that student's candidacy. So, there's no exact answer, right? I could say here, I know everybody wants, oh, if you're ranked number 6, right? You're good to go. There's no more returns. You've hit the maximum. Colleges don't care after you hit number 6 in your class, right? But at what high school, right? With what rest of your candidacy? With what other wow factors or special buckets? Or what about the other kids who are in, the top 5, or the kids are below you? Or what if it's a class of 6 kids versus a class of 600 kids, right? And so it would be nice if we could just come up with an absolute answer, but it just doesn't work that way. And so I'll try to give some, you know, a bit of an answer here, but it also is just gonna depend, right? So, but it's a very good thing to be thinking about and to be understanding how you should be allocating your time so that if you have conflicts, if you can't, right, if there's 2 things that come into conflict, in terms of time allocation, you can allocate your time in the way that is the most strategic and most likely to optimize, your goal. First thing I'll say is not all high schools, many high schools no longer rank their students. And so, obviously, this is not necessarily going to be as conspicuous of an issue for many people. Now, that being said, there still are distributions at high schools where they can still see roughly what the distribution is of the GPAs and the grade. And it's just because your high school doesn't formally rank its students, which is much more common at public schools, very uncommon for many private high schools or smaller public high schools. Just because your school doesn't officially rank doesn't mean the college doesn't have any sense of sort of where you stand in the class, right? So let's sort of get that out of the way, right? Now, one thing that I've seen is that students who particularly do have a school that ranks them, one issue they can fall into is they just basically let that hijack their candidacy, and they're just extremely worried, and all of their moves basically are designed to beat out the other students at their high school and to just basically almost unilaterally optimize their class ranking at a cost that is simply not worth it for their college candidacy potentially, right? So you do have to be aware of that. And it's much more the case when there's just a conspicuous core board and you can see what your class ranking is in all of your transcripts. And it's not that you shouldn't be worried about it. Of course, you should be worried about what your class rank is. It's obviously an important variable that goes into the equation, right? But you can't let it necessarily just hijack all of your tactics in terms of your candidacy building, right? And again, that's unilateral optimization without seeing the bigger picture, other parts of your candidacy. And many students allow that to be the case, right? They sort of oversaturate their course rigor. They now get a B, right? They take on potentially too much risk that really wasn't necessary because, it was just too much risk and too little reward for them to go from number 8 in their class out of 363 to number 4, right? And so it's a great just framework. The way the student is thinking is very wise to be thinking in this way. It doesn't mean that, one way is right or the other way is right, or that you shouldn't worry about your class rank because you're number 7 out of 301, but it's something you need to be thinking about, but it's much more contextual, right? So what you also need to know is what does your resume look like, right? You need to basically have your resume scored. Is your resume in range for your college goals or is it not, right? Do you have actually any time conflicts? A lot of people assume there's a conflict, but there's not necessarily a conflict, right? Sometimes the student has plenty of time and they could both improve their class rank and they can improve their resume simultaneously. And if that's the case, then what are we even talking about? Just do both of them, right? And a lot of people, again, there may be time that you're not looking at that maybe needs to be discarded. Again, maybe you do track, right? And it's just not that important, right? For your candidacy, if you're serious about going to a top college and you just can't afford to do it anymore, you're in junior year and you just have other things that need to be higher priority if this goal is important to you, right? You be spending 18 hours a week on social media like most teenagers, right? There's usually time, you just need to find it, right? You just need to sometimes question assumptions that you haven't been questioning. And what you really need to do is you need to write it all out on paper or put it in spreadsheets, right? And do time audits, right? This is very often what we do to see how you're spending your time. So a lot of times, people, they have certain assumptions built in, like, I can't do both X and Y, like, they're mutually exclusive. I can't take my class rank from number 7 to top 5 or top 3 and also build a resume. But again, that depends on what your current time allocation is. It depends on how much time would be required to marginally improve your class rank. It would depend on what your current resume is, and it would depend on how much time it would take to improve your resume to where it needs to get, right? Or at least, again, where we estimate that it needs to get, right? Since we don't 100% know, right? Again, since there is just a limitless ceiling and we don't know exactly what the score cutoff is going to be for you getting in because we don't know everybody else's candidacy. But in terms of what we estimate there, we could say, okay, your resume is at, we just got to throw a number, right? And we say, okay, it's at a 7 out of 10. We to get it 9 out of 10. And to go from a 7 out of 10 to a 9 out of 10 is going to take 12 hours a week, right? And you have 18 hours a week. Well, you still have 6 hours a week to improve your academic class ranking. And so maybe you could just do both of them. Again, a lot of these questions are very poorly framed because they, again, there's certain assumptions baked in, like these tactics are mutually exclusive when they may not actually be mutually exclusive, right? The students frame the question in such a way that, it's an X or Y, but it may just be a false dichotomy, right? It may not be the answer may not be X or Y. That's one of the things that is extremely common in the admissions process. Is many people, um, their questions are actually just wrong. The way they frame the question is wrong. The question doesn't make any sense. And so, questions that don't make any sense or framed in the wrong way usually beget suboptimal answers, right? And so we basically have to understand the student's full candidacy. Okay, we know they're ranked number 7. How much time would it take them? What courses do they need to take? Like, we have to get very specific, right? We have to understand, okay, what's the rest of their candidacy look like? Okay, how much improvement does it require? How much time would that take? And so we actually start mapping it out and making it a lot more specific and more detailed. That being said, in terms of just some general considerations here, if your school ranks, and just in general, if you can ascertain some sort of GPA distribution and sort of get some sense of where the student is in their class, top 10% usually is a pretty meaningful cutoff to the colleges. That's what they often report the most. And so for this student, they have about 300 students in the grade. Being in the top 30 usually is going to be a fairly significant inflection point, right? But again, it depends on the high school, right? Depends on the actual size of the class. It could be this is a school that, I don't know, they maybe have a really poor curriculum. Maybe they never send any kids to top colleges. Maybe it has no reputation, right? And so maybe that pushes the student to needing to be higher in their class, right? Versus, okay, this is one of the best, high schools in the country. There's amazing students there, really highly regarded curriculum, well-known school. Maybe there are 50 kids getting into top colleges, right? And so again, that's another nuance that may matter as well in terms of pushing more necessity in terms of your class rank being potentially higher. That said, just kind of taking a general shot at this, I would say the student needs to ideally be in at least the top 30 as sort of the bottom end line of demarcation to be in the top 10%. They've cleared that. They're well past that, right? They're number 7. After that, is there much of a difference between number 30 out of 300 or being number 24 or being number 20? No, right? I would say probably the next point that's probably gonna be somewhat meaningful would be maybe being top 15 and especially top 10. There's a reasonable margin there between a student who's number 25 and a student who's number 8, right? But the student is here number 7, right? So they are top 10 of their class. It's a reasonably sized class, right? They've definitely cleared the top 10% as sort of the bottom end for highly selective colleges, and they're in the top 10. Is there a big difference between them being 7 or being 6? No, not really, right? Is there a big difference? In most cases, again, I'm sort of collapsing against most of the nuances being 7 and being number 5. Not really. That being said, we have to sort of know what would be required if the jump from them going from number 7 to valedictorian is not going to expose their candidacy to maybe major risk. We have to look at their, the performance in certain classes, know the teachers. It's just much more complex. We have to sort of understand what the moves are that would be required for the students if they could even, again, we don't 100% know, is it even possible, right? At some point, it might just be mathematically impossible for the student to catch up, right? There's all sorts of other nuances in terms of high school's transcripts. So they take in external college courses. We could attenuate the risk there because the external college courses, you have to sort of see those if you take them, do you have to put them on the transcript? Usually you don't, right? But there's all sorts of different situations here, right? And in terms of risk and reward, right? If you have to basically again, if we have to overexpose the student's candidacy to a bunch of risk and it's an uncomfortable amount of risk, we have to put them in an AP class with a teacher in senior year who deflates grades, or whatever it is, and we just don't like that amount of risk, it may just not be worth it to go after it, right? And to try to really improve your class ranking. But there might be another situation where the student has sufficient amount of time, or we can find other time to remove. They can improve their resume and they could go after it and they could improve their class ranking and they may get some more quote unquote candidacy points and it may not be exposing them to too much risk, right? And so is it, just sort of the overly simplistic answer that the student maybe wants or maybe many people want? Is there a major difference between, 7 and number 1? No, it's not absolutely major in most contexts, but again, it may depend on what the high school is, it may depend on a whole bunch of other factors, and we want to know those other factors first, and again, we would just want to know where the student currently stands in their whole candidacy, all these contextual factors. Is this just a false dichotomy? Can the student actually just improve their resume, their extracurriculars? We don't even know. The student might have extracurriculars, and extracurriculars are amazing, right? And so they may have just phrased it as, should I improve my class rank or should I improve my extracurriculars? But their extracurriculars might be amazing, right? And so it's just, I mean, this is a recurrent theme on the podcast. It just depends on so many other factors and variables. And many people just don't ask questions. You don't ask them in a way that is begetting of an optimal answer, right? You have to really write down everything and really look at it very carefully on paper. Next question. So the title is Need Better Extracurriculars. So I'm a junior and I really need some advice on how to get better extracurriculars, especially ones outside of school. For reference, I used to want to major in biochem to be pre-med, but now I want to major in sociology or African American studies, still want to be pre-med, and I have no ideas what extracurriculars to do for those. I'm trying to go to WashU and my academic stats right now aren't that great, so I'm trying to make up for it with my extracurriculars. Right now, I only have around 3 clubs with a leadership position and some minor volunteering. I'm in the process of trying to start a school newspaper, tutoring organization, and Black Student Union, all things that my school needs, and even my principal has suggested someone to do, but that's still limited to making impact at my school, and I want to go beyond that. Okay, so again, this is very typical, which is patient goes into the doctor's office and says, "Hey, I need this procedure," right? And in reality, they don't need the procedure, they're not a doctor, and they don't actually know what they need, right? So, they think they need triple bypass, and all they need is some Tums. So, you have to be very careful in terms of before you rush to go, rush into the tactics based on somebody else's diagnosis of what's wrong. The patient's diagnosis, you have to actually see is that the fundamental constraint on the candidacy, right? Are we actually solving the problem that needs to be solved? So the student is very specifically worried about their extracurriculars, but and is asking a question about the extracurriculars. They sort of diagnose what's wrong with their profile, but right in the middle of the question, they said my academic stats right now aren't that great. So I'm trying to make up for it with my extracurriculars, right? This is what many people do, right? They try to solve grades issues with, because I have a lot of coursework, right? They try to solve grades issues with SAT scores. They try to solve grades issues with extracurriculars. How about you try to solve grades issues, grades problems with grade solutions? Why can't the student just improve their grades? Why can't they do tutoring, free, the basically infinite number of free online resources? Why can't they go to the teacher for office hours? Why can't they ask for extra credit assignments? Why can't they devote all this marginal amount of time that they're already racing to put into, more impressive extracurriculars, right? Because it does seem like they at least have a foundation of a solid extracurricular profile. It's just not at the level that they want it to be at, which of course is obviously would be necessary for top colleges. But the problem is the foundation of their candidacy is not competitive for top colleges, and so going about solving this other problem without solving the true problem doesn't actually make any sense, right? Now, the only way in which this would make sense is if the student basically has done absolutely everything to improve their grades, and they simply can't do it, right? That's almost never the case, right? And the way that this is framed, it doesn't sound like we're talking about a B plus or two, right? They say my academic stats right now aren't that great. Usually that means it's a lot worse, right? And so that probably means that they're not viable at all for more competitive colleges, which means going to create a resume oriented towards top colleges doesn't make much sense, right? And this is also where people get lost in terms of they hear other people's advice and they're in a forum or talking to people who have top 10 goals, who are talking about tactics that are required for top 10 colleges. And you have a student who has an academic profile that's in line for top 60 colleges. And they're now looking, they're listening to other people and they're saying, oh, I need to do this in my extracurriculars. It's like, no, 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 you have a different candidacy. And even irrespective of what your goals may actually be, first of all, you may not have the goals as the same goals as the other people that you're listening to. But even if you do, it may not matter because your candidacy may just not even be in the range. Those colleges might have already been eliminated, right? And this is another issue that you see very often in students' candidacies with families. They are adopting tactics that are necessary for a tier of college that they are no longer competitive for. Let that sink in for a second. Let me repeat that. There are many students and families who are adopting tactics, right? This is like they're like the students here, right? They're like very concerned about their extracurriculars not being good enough, right? They're adopting tactics and racing to go do tactics that are required for a tier of college that they are not even any longer competitive for, right? And so it basically makes 0 sense. And it is very often it's just because admissions is not transparent, it doesn't have a scoreboard, and so you don't even know that you've been eliminated from those colleges and that those tactics are basically meaningless, right? And I'm not gonna say they're totally meaningless. First of all, obviously, doing your best and trying your hardest, in life is obviously a great strategy, right? And there's the saying, how you do anything is how you do everything, and et cetera, right? Then there's also obviously, even if you just improve your candidacy a ton and it's just still not going to be enough to get you into a certain tier of college, well, it may just add extra cushioning, or you may get a merit scholarship at the lower colleges or whatever it is, right? So I'm not going to say that's bad, just in an absolute sense, right? But at least with respect to accomplishing the objective that you think you're accomplishing, it might be utterly pointless. So I think this is a really great illustration of a patient, right? A student here. This is so common. Going to WebMD, right? ChatGPT, or look this up, right? And just diagnosing, just going about solving something in potentially a wrong way. And I don't like that people are trying to solve grades issues with test scores, right? A whole bunch of those students. And I don't like that people are trying to solve grades issues with extracurriculars. Why don't you just try to solve grades issues grades problems with grade solutions, right? And again, the only way this would sort of even remotely make sense is if the student basically just has no chance. They've just done everything in the world, right? There's done everything in the world. They're studying in the library, 5 hours. They're going to the office hours. They're in maximum extra credit assignments. Usually, what this is, and you can sort of tell in the question, it's when the person they don't like that solution, right? They have some other skill set and maybe they're better at the extracurriculars. And so they gravitate towards the extracurriculars because they're just better at that maybe than they are at school, right? And this is just very true of life, right? We gravitate towards our strengths. And obviously, that's generally a pretty good strategy in life. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're solving the biggest issue in terms of at least your college candidacy, right? It might just be, well, you're better oriented or better equipped, to solve the extracurricular problem. You maybe like it more, and you don't sort of like staring the grades problem in the face and sort of saying, I'm not nearly as good as this, or I don't enjoy this as much. But this is really the main problem that I need to confront. And this is the really my number one priority, not going again to trying to solve grades issues with extracurriculars because it's not really going to matter, right? If the foundational core of your candidacy is insufficient, massively improving and trying to build extracurriculars, to get yourself into top 20 colleges when your grades are top 75, it just doesn't make much sense. I think this is a good question in terms of illustrating several different points, but a lot of people are trying to compensate for issues in their candidacy, particularly grades, and they want somebody to tell them, and the admissions officer again, this holistic review, and they look at everything, right? They want the reassurance. But I'm just gonna tell you the way that it actually is, which is if the grades really aren't very good, this is not going to solve the problem, and it's not going to accomplish much. And these parts of your candidacy are not just simply averaged out. That's not how it works, right? It's not as though you just have you can have top 75 grades, but a top 10 resume, and just average. It's not how it works, right? There's different gates and different tiers. You'd have a certain academic index and a certain amount of academic proficiency for those extracurriculars to even matter. This is a good example of just going about solving a problem in your candidacy in the wrong way, and maybe just the way that you don't actually want to solve it, right, or to confront that issue. All right, last question. Please read my full post. I will have spent 5 years in high school by the time I graduate due to repeating 10th grade for moving reasons. This year I'm a junior. I'm taking 6 APs, which is the standard for my school. I'm getting a B in Physics C, and I can't really get it up by this point. If I drop it, I will not be taking a lab science by my junior year, taking AP Computer Science A and took AP Physics C last year, a different version of AP Physics C. But while I've taken 4 years of lab sciences by the time I graduate anyways, I got a few B pluses last year in physics, English, and history. I'll be taking one less class my junior year than my sophomore year. If I drop it, I can take 7 APs my senior year, though. Should I drop it? My transcript won't show that I dropped it, and my high school doesn't use the Common App course reader rating, but colleges might see that I didn't take a lab science my junior year and disqualify me. Thanks so much. What my junior transcript would look like with or without this physics class. So they have an A in real analysis, which means they're extremely advanced in math, way beyond almost every student. AP Lit, they have an A minus. A Push, they have an A. French 4 AP, they have an A. And then AP Computer Science A, they have an A. And then in this physics class, they have a B. Right? And as they drop it, it won't appear on the transcript. So first issue is the student already has multiple B pluses in their sophomore year of high school in 3 different classes. And so they're going and getting another B in junior year is really potentially costly, especially to the trend line of the grades, right? Now, it doesn't mean, again, just because your grades are on upward trajectory, it doesn't mean that they're not just going to take a student over you who has straight A's all throughout high school, but it's still obviously going to be better if the B's ended in 10th grade than if they continued on to 11th grade and potentially 12th grade, right? So I would say the student's margin for error is extremely minimal at this point in time because they already have 3 B pluses in 10th grade, right? And it's a different type of narrative. If they don't get another B in 11th grade and they do 11th grade and first part of 12th grade with all A's, that looks a lot different than if, yet again, in another year, in 11th grade, the last full year before applying, they get another B, right? And this is a big issue for students who maybe got, a B plus in ninth grade, but then they were all A's in 10th grade, and then they're, all A's in 11th grade, and then you're just on a straight upward trajectory, and then senior year, you get another B right before you apply to college, right? It's like you messed up the overcoming narrative, right? Or just the straight trend line, right? Like went back down again, right? So the student has to be particularly careful on that front because they already have 3 B pluses, right? And so they're going to mess up this narrative of sort of they're on a straight rise after 10th grade, right? And so there's that part of it, which makes it, even riskier. Second part is it's not a B plus, it's a B. Now, I don't know how the student knows that they can't get this grade up. They have sort of said they can't get it up. I don't know if they mean that they can't get it up before they would have to drop the class or if they mean they can't get it up before the end of the year. I don't know how they would know for sure that they can't get it up by the end of the year. It's possible they can't get it up before the drop deadline, but I don't know how they would know for sure that they can't get it up by the end of the year, and I would question that assumption here, right? And so, as I mentioned in my answers to many other questions, you need to get much more specific than this, right? You have to have the student's full transcript. You need to know all the nuances of the teacher, the class, what they've done to date. Is there something we can change about, the inputs that would maybe create a much different output in terms of the grade of the class, right? So the student basically has been doing the absolute maximum and has exaggerated every improvement strategy, and the grade is at a B. That would be different than if there are several things that are suboptimal, right? The student's not going to office hours, they're not doing extra credit assignments if that's allowed, they're not doing tutoring, they're not doing extra studying, whatever it is, right? If they basically have absolutely maxed out every possible input strategy, right, on the input side, investing in the class, then there would be much less hope that this grade is going to go up, right? And so you have to see what they're currently doing, right? But it's, the definition of insanity to expect different results when you have basically the same inputs, right? And so this is one thing you want to look at when you have a student who has lower grades in a class and potentially you need to make a high stakes decision whether to drop it or not, is what would change on the input side that would create a difference, in terms of the outputs, right? Side or the outcome of the class, right? And again, if they're trying their absolute hardest and they've every single thing they could possibly do, they've done, and then I don't wanna say hopeless, but obviously there's a lot less hope that, there's something that's going to change on the output side because, there's just not much more that we could do on the input side, right? And so that's really a very careful, thing that you need to look at to see, okay, what does this look like in the inputs? Are there any other strategies that we can adopt to further improve this grade? Now, that being said, if we sort of, once you sort of do that analysis, if we've drawn the conclusion the student is at very high risk of ending the year, getting another B, especially a flat B, then yeah, you might just have to pull the cord and you might have to do something else. They may have to try to take this externally. They may try to take the class again in senior year, just wipe it off the transcript. It's not ideal for them to not take a core science class in junior year and it'll look a little weird. However, most of the decision making in admissions isn't a matter of optimal conditions. It's not a matter of, oh, this is the optimal thing to do. It's when the optimal decisions or the optimal, sort of maneuvers or what the orthodox maneuvers are or the sort of rules that you should follow when they come into conflict with each other. Right. And so you sort of have a couple of different maxims or principles coming into conflict. One is don't get a B, but that, sort of runs up against, take core science classes for all 4 years of your high school curriculum, right? And so they're in conflict, right? The 2 maxims are in conflict with each other, right? And that's usually the type of decision making that you're often confronted with, right? Is when they're actually coming into conflict. Two different maxims, guidelines, principles are coming into conflict with each other. There'd have to be a much deeper dive here to actually sort of assess the risk of the class. The preference, of course, would be that the student just brings up their grade, and you would have to first question basically whether that's possible. They're saying it's not possible. You'd have to actually, I would first question that, but it is highly risky if they're this late in the year and they're at a B. And so this may just require, again, we sort of have to break one of the maxims, which is we probably would optimize for them not getting a B in this case, just because they have several Bs, and it's probably highly critical for them to maintain that upward trajectory. The other thing that I'll say is this is very common. So the student has extremely optimized course rigor, but you can see what's happening, right? They're also getting a lot of Bs. And so this is the other thing that when you are doing course selection, you need to be mindful of, which is the past. It needs to be evidence based. It can't be ego based or pride based. If the student has shown evidence of not being capable of getting A's in rigorous classes in the past, you need to take that into account in the future, right? And you need to potentially bring it back a little bit to get it more to the point that it needs to be, which is we basically say that you need to take the hardest amount of course rigor or the highest amount of course rigor while still optimizing for straight A's. That could be A minus, but 90 or above, basically, right? But that is where you need to optimize is more along the lines of not having anything below an A minus. Um, and a lot of people just optimize for the course rigor itself, right? But it's basically taking the hardest amount of course rigor while still being 90 and above in your coursework, right? And so the student looks the way that many students look, which is they are sort of unilaterally optimizing for course rigor. It sounds like they also might be an extremely competitive high school. They said that taking 6 APs is the standard for their school. And they may just be in an environment that is sort of pushing their maneuvers or their tactics in a way that's not actually potentially optimal for them. Now, that being said, obviously you're being, somewhat compared to your peers in your high school and being juxtaposition, but it doesn't mean that you necessarily just go down that route, as I mentioned with class ranking, right? It doesn't mean that you have to be aware of the context and what the student's competing against, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you go and get 4 Bs on your transcript. Doesn't mean that that's the optimal strategy either. And it could be that pulling back on, 1, 2, 3 of these courses, it could be the student's going to end up with, I mean, their math curriculum is accelerated through the roof. Basically, taking real analysis in 11th grade is just an extreme outlier, right? So it could be the case that they're basically playing a game that's getting them to, who knows, 14 APs or something. And if they did 10 APs, they'd be a straight A student. But they're now 14 APs and they have 4 or 5 Bs. And unequivocally, the student, all else being equal, who has 10 APs, right, and is a straight A student, is going to look way more impressive than the student who has 14 and has 4 Bs on their transcript or 5 Bs on their transcript, right? It basically just looks like you tried to challenge yourself and you weren't particularly successful. These are all different, considerations, but you do have to sort of question some of the assumptions. Is it really true that we can't get up that B by the end of the year? It is very risky though. If the student stays in the class, they're at very high risk, and the fact that it's a flat B instead of a B plus would make me highly concerned that they could bring it up. It's just very high risk because if they get past the drop deadline, then we can't remove it from the transcript, and they already have multiple Bs on their transcript. This is sort of a bit of like the straw that's going to potentially break the camel's back here. So it would be highly risky. I would still get the information in terms of what it looked like on the input side, and to see if what the exact probability is that they'd be able to bring up the grade. But either way, it does look very risky that they're at a flat B and they're basically in front of the drop deadline and they have multiple Bs on their transcript. It's a very dicey situation, but again, there are many students who just way over optimize on the course rigor and in these very tricky positions with too many Bs on their transcript, and it just ruins their college candidacy. So you have to look at the past, you have to look at the evidence, and particularly if you have a track record of getting Bs in highly rigorous courses, you need to look at the evidence in terms of your future decision making. This student didn't, and just basically stayed on the track of just sort of unilaterally optimizing for the course rigor, and they potentially will pay the price for it. So, okay, that's pretty much it in terms of all these questions. Hopefully, this was helpful to everyone, sort of talking through these different situations and different factors. And we'll talk soon in the next episode. Bye bye.